trying to save it for the holidays. Actually, I get that chance to be here. Yeah. Right now.
I want to thank you all so much for coming today. My name is Olivia Zink. I'm the Executive Director of Open Democracy Action. We're one of the hosts of today's forum. And today's forum is co-hosted by Equal Citizen. And ready for this whole long list. The New Hampshire Independent Voters, New Hampshire Labor News, New Hampshire Ranked Choice Voting, Fix It America, the New Hampshire Committee for Ranked Choice Voting, New Hampshire's Restoring Democracy, Stamp Stampede, American Promise, UU Action, Fair Vote, Take Back Our Republic, Protect Democracy, and Common Cause. So lots of different organizations that care about fixing the root problem of our democracy, which is the focus of today's event. And just a reminder that today's event is a nonpartisan discussion of democracy issues, so please keep partisan rhetoric to a minimum. We want to fix the issues that are plaguing the system, and we need voters and legislators from all parties to join together for the good of the country. There are index cards in the back, and Chris has some. I have already collected a few questions, and I'm going to start with a few questions, and then we will take questions from the index cards. And so if we want to just begin with a chance for you to introduce yourself, tell folks about your family and why you're running for president.
Sure. Well, Olivia, thank you for having me, and thank you for hosting. Can everyone hear me? I think that is a yes.
Is that all we got for him? Come on, let's hear it.
You're the candy man. You didn't get one.
I'm the candy man, you name it.
Yeah. So thanks for having me. My name is John Delaney, and I am running for president. I'll give you a little bit of background about who I am and how I've lived my life. I grew up in York, Jersey, in a blue-collar family. My dad was actually an electrician, a union electrician, so I grew up in a union household. Neither of my parents went to college. I was the first in my family to go to college. I ended up going to Columbia University and then down to Georgetown Law School for law school. Where the best thing that could have ever happened to me happened, and that is I met my wife at law school. She's from Idaho. Her dad was a potato farmer. So the union electrician's son meets the potato farmer's daughter, only in America. And after law school, we decided to stay in the D.C., Maryland area, and that's where we've raised our family. We have 4 daughters. My oldest just got married 2 weeks ago, actually, and it was a real joyous occasion. It was an interfaith marriage. It was conducted in a cathedral. We had an Episcopal reverend conduct the service, but we also had a Catholic priest, because we're Catholic, and a rabbi, because my son-in-law is Jewish. It's almost like a joke, the reverend, the priest, and the rabbi walked into the bar. But so I have 4 daughters, 26 down to 12. My wife April has had a very successful career as a nonprofit attorney. She focuses on communications law, but really with a particular focus on how media and technology companies affect our kids. She runs the Washington office for a group called Common Sense Media, which is a very large nonprofit focusing on these issues. And she's been active and one of the leaders in the country on the issue. I became an entrepreneur. I started 2 businesses in the Maryland area, both located in suburban Maryland. They were fortunately successful. I took them public. I was the youngest CEO in the history of the New York Stock Exchange. My company's created thousands of jobs. But about 10 years ago, April and I decided to dedicate the rest of our lives to public service. And that led me to run for Congress. I was first elected in 2012 to represent Maryland's 6th congressional district in the Congress of the United States, where I proudly served for 6 years. I think there are many issues facing our nation, but one of the central issues is how divisive we are, and how divided we are as a people. And that's a big part of my campaign, restoring a sense of common purpose to who we are as a country. Because I think that's central to everything. And we're going to touch on a lot of the forces and factors that divide us today, because there's some structural issues in our democracy right now which really get at this structural divisiveness. But it's caused a very significant cost to the American people, because what's really happened, in my opinion, over the last several decades is the world has changed very rapidly because of technological innovation and globalization. Forces that are enormously positive. In fact, if you look at the global rate of poverty, it's gone down literally every year for about 30 years. We've watched billions of human beings being lifted out of poverty because of these forces. But they're also causing huge stress. Our environment, national security issues, and in particular, they've caused huge numbers of our citizens to be left behind economically. And they've hollowed out huge parts of this country. And in my opinion, this didn't have to happen. There are things we could have done as a nation a long time ago to prepare our country and our citizens for this change. We didn't do it. And the reason we didn't do it, in my opinion, is because of lots of things. In politics, other kind of structural problems like gerrymandering, but also because we're so divided, and our leaders put political victories over the common good. And a big part of my campaign is someone who stands for something very different than that. I have a very different background. I'm the only person running for president who was a successful entrepreneur and a successful public servant. And I grew up in a blue-collar family, so I understand the perspective of most Americans. And I think I bring that to the job, so that's why I'm doing it. And I'm grateful to be with you here today.
And so as a former member of Congress, you understand that our democracy, members of Congress spend a lot of time raising money.
Yes.
A lot of time, too much time. How would you change the way campaigns are funded?
Well, let me start at the top. The first thing I would like to do is either overturn or have Citizens United overturned, or potentially have a constitutional amendment to overturn it. Both of those things are very hard to do. A big part of my campaign is telling the truth. As president, I'd be entirely supportive of not only electing justices or nominating justices to the Supreme Court that would look at things like Citizens United very differently. But I'd also be supportive of a constitutional amendment to overturn it. But I think there's things we can do legislatively to mute its impact. And that includes putting limits on how much any entity can give to a super PAC, and also requiring disclosure. So if someone were to give money to my campaign, the most they can give is $2,800. And if they give more than $200, they have to disclose their name, their address, and their occupation. So you can look up all of my donors, and I don't take any money from PACs or any of that stuff. You can look up all of my donors and decide who's giving me money. A super PAC, as you know, there's no limit on how much money people can give to them. Someone can give $100 million to a super PAC, and they don't have to say who they are. So it's really dark money. So even before we overturn it, either through the courts or with the constitutional amendment, we can actually pass laws, just like we did for individual campaigns. Because we used to, 50 years ago, there was no limit on how much anyone could give. But now there is. We can pass those same laws for these super PACs. So that's one thing I want to do. The second thing I'd like to do is empower small dollar donors with more federal financing of elections and more matching programs. I think that would help democratize this process more. I think these proposals to limit when members of Congress can raise money, not allow them to do it when Congress is in session, all that kind of stuff, I'm fully supportive of all those things. So those are some of the things I would do on money in politics, which is a huge, huge issue. But it's not the only issue.
Great. And we're just going to continue on this theme. Thank you for co-sponsoring Government by the People Act, which would provide public financing. I know your state, Maryland, has county-level public financing, and there's different ways to do it through giving each voter certificates to fund candidates, through matching fund grants. Just wondering your thoughts on what's the best way to change, to have public financing of elections.
Yeah, I don't have a strong opinion on the notion of giving voters these vouchers to give to candidates. I mean, I could see that being interesting, but I could also see that not being the best way to do it. I really do like programs that provide matching funds and also public financing of elections. I tend to think those are more successful ways of doing it, but I'm not opposed to the other ideas.
Great. And so you talked a little bit about disclosing dark money, but if elected president on day one, would you sign an executive order requiring disclosure on anybody who's spending money to influence elections?
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about gerrymandering. Maryland is one of the states that's sort of known for gerrymandering for Democratic purposes.
Yes.
Other states have been gerrymandered for Republican purpose. So what would you do to change the way or reform our system so that you're not favoring incumbents or polarizing any political parties?
What is gerrymandering?
What is gerrymandering? We can start with that too.
I get around, but I don't get around that much.
I don't know what it is either.
So the correct pronunciation, even though I always call it gerrymandering as well, is gerrymandering.
What's that?
Well, it involves the creation of congressional districts for political purposes, as opposed to for, the way we think of how congressional districts should represent constituencies. And the term came from, I think it was the governor of Massachusetts, his name was Geary, who drew a congressional district way back when he was governor that looked like a salamander. So that's where the term gerrymander comes from, which has now been popularly known as gerrymandering.
Yeah.
So, the way our Constitution works is congressional districts actually used to be at large way back. And then what's happened, obviously, is they're now drawn based on physical boundaries. And I think historically we've had a view that these districts should be drawn to represent communities of interest. In other words, they should be somewhat compact. They should do their best, if it's a rural community, to try to create a rural district. If it's an urban district, try to create an urban district. But what's happened, and it's gotten worse over the last several decades because of big data technologies, and the ability to actually precisely figure out who lives in what house and how they vote, we've created these politically mapped districts, where if you look at them on paper, they don't look compact. They're oftentimes stretched in weird shapes and designed to create districts that will vote either Democrat or Republican. So if you're a state that is controlled by Democrats, you gerrymander these districts to create as many Democratic districts as possible. I live in the state of Maryland. We are considered a Democratic state, but we have a Republican governor. So we're obviously not overwhelmingly Democratic, yet of our 8 congressional districts, 7 of them are democratically held and 1 is Republican. And so the allegation is that it's gerrymandered to create Democratic districts. Similarly with Texas, but in the other way. Right, those districts are overwhelmingly Republican, and they've been gerrymandered. So this is a really insidious force, and this working with money in politics is really the problem. Sometimes 1 + 1 does equal 3, and that's what happens when you take gerrymandering and money in politics. Because what gerrymandering does is it creates one-sided congressional districts. So it creates districts that are safe Democrat or safe Republican. So for representatives in those districts, the general election is irrelevant, and all that matters is the primary. And primaries, unfortunately, have very bad voter turnout. And the people who tend to vote in primaries tend to be more activists. So if you believe incentives matter, which I do, because of all these gerrymandered districts, we have members of Congress who are incentivized to appeal to the most active members in their party, because they really don't have a general election opponent. So they don't even ever have to think about the other side of the aisle. They only worry about the loudest voices in the room. And then when you combine money with that, you can have things like the NRA, which has a big footprint in primaries, much bigger than they do in general elections. They can put huge amounts of money into Republican primaries in safe congressional districts, and they can really have an outsized influence. Which is why 97% of the American people want universal background checks, but the Congress of the United States won't do it.
Could I answer
So
that?
that's,
Could I answer that?
Well, we can talk more a little bit afterwards, but I want to thank you for your support about the Open Our Democracy
Yes.
Act, which actually requires an independent redistricting commission.
that was my bill, by the way. So I drafted a bill, I gave a long answer of what it is, but I'll give you my solution. I drafted a bill called Open Our Democracy Act, and it requires independent commissions. I think 7 states in the country have independent commissions, and what that means is either judicial bodies or truly independent nonpartisan commissions actually draw the districts. They're not drawn by the state legislatures, who are the people who make these kind of one-sided liberal districts.
Great. And so Congress passed, or proposed H.R. 1,
Yes.
the biggest democracy reform package, which solved money in politics, redistricting reform, voting rights. Your thoughts on H.R. 1 and what other reforms can happen at the federal level?
I support H.R. 1 fully.
And then do you support restoring the Voting Rights Act?
Absolutely. And my former colleague, Congresswoman Tara Sewell, has the Voting Rights Amendment Act that would be my judgment the best way of doing that.
And for those that might not know about it, will you elaborate more?
Yeah, I mean, the issue with the Voting Rights Act was a very important piece of legislation that was designed to effectively empower the federal government to prevent certain states and certain regions from engaging in voter suppression. And it needs to be amended. And what it's really doing is empowering the federal government to have the tools it needs to prevent voter suppression.
Great. And your mic keeps falling down there.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. I just want to make sure everyone can hear you. The state of Maine has a different system of electing folks ranked choice voting, and just to know what you thought about ranked choice voting and if you support other proposals around voting rights.
Yeah. I think ranked choice voting is interesting. All of these things have positive and negatives. California has a system, top two, right? So what that means is the top two vote getters in a primary actually are in the general election. They can be two Democrats and two Republicans if it's a really one-sided district. If you have a congressional district that's 80% Democrat, then often in the primary, the top two vote getters are two Democrats, and they effectively engage in a runoff in the general election. I think all of these things are positive. I think they're not perfect, and occasionally they produce some results that people question. But I do think our system is so broken that we need these kind of innovations.
Great. So New Hampshire has passed some interesting laws in the recent years, Senate Bill 3 and House Bill 1264, which changes what you need to register to vote, and also you must get a New Hampshire driver's license and register your car within 60 days. Thoughts on these types of laws and other laws around the country that are targeted to limit participation of who's voting?
I think interesting is a generous term for these laws. Look, I think most of these things are designed to limit voter participation. I think there's very little incident of voter fraud in the United States of America. And I think most of these things are designed to limit voter participation. I know that what they, talk about with college kids here, which is they have to certify an intent to stay in the state. How does a college kid know what their intent's going to be? I didn't know what my intent was when I was in college. So I think all these things are designed to effectively reduce voter turnout, so I'm opposed to these things.
So there are some proposals to change the way the electoral colleges. What changes would you make to the electoral college and why?
So this is how I think about the electoral college system. If I were starting from scratch, I would likely do something very different. But I think the chances of us changing the electoral college are non-existent, because it would involve a constitutional amendment, and it would involve the small states deciding that they have less impact in national politics. And I don't see why any small states are ever going to agree to do that. So I think the chances of it happening are truly non-existent. So I think it's a divisive issue that doesn't really have a point to it. That there are so many other more productive things for us to be spending our time on. And I know this isn't a partisan event, but I'm going to speak as a Democrat here for a second, which is there's a perception around the United States of America, and I know this because I've campaigned, I've been to all 99 counties in Iowa, for example. And a lot of people around the country think that the Democratic Party is controlled by the, quote, coastal elites, and that folks in California and New York are calling the shots in the Democratic Party. And the problem with advocating for the Electoral College change, particularly since it's something that's not going to happen, you're basically sending a message to the American people that that's actually what you want to have happen. Because there's no question that if we change the Electoral College system, it would massively empower voters in California and New York in choosing our president. That's not going to happen, and I don't think it's productive for the Democratic Party to go around the heartland in this country where we actually have a real resident message, in my opinion, and real policies to help struggling people, and to start talking about how we want to make them less relevant in our national politics.
What about the interstate compact that would in effect do away with the electoral college system for those states?
Yeah, that could potentially happen, but you know, that again, that's kind of an organic process, as opposed to a top-down president saying, I want to gut the power of the heartland. You know, that's kind of how and my point is, I think in terms of, look, we should have passed the Equal Rights Amendment a long time ago. There's no argument against the Equal Rights Amendment. Literally, I've never met anyone who can give me a straight-faced argument against the Equal Rights Amendment. There's overturning Citizens United, there's all these kind of things. There's a long list of constitutional amendments that I am hugely supportive of. I just don't think this is going to make it very high in the queue, I guess is what I'm saying. So I think those things like the interstate compact, that's different. That's kind of an organic states-up process. You know, that's up to the decisions of those states. So that's, you know, that's it. I view that as entirely, that's a different ballgame. That's people making a decision in their states about how they want to use it.
Support that.
Yeah, if that's what the states want to do. Absolutely. See what I mean? But as opposed to this edict from the top that we're going to change the Constitution, I think that, again, if I was starting from scratch, there's a whole bunch of things I'd probably do differently, but we all know we're not starting from scratch.
Great. So Capitol Hill has become a farm league for K Street and other lobbying firms. So when you think about members of Congress leaving their job and becoming a lobbyist, when you think about other lobbyist reforms and ending the revolving door, what are your positions on that?
I definitely want to end the revolving door. I find it insidious, and I've seen lots of examples of it where people go into government and out in the private sector into government, so I think we got to end that. I'm not sure I'm in favor of, quote, lifetime bans. And that's just a practical perspective. Like, let's say one of my children is interested in public service and wants to work on Capitol Hill. Should that then prohibit her from ever being a, quote, lobbyist for the League of Conservation Voters? You know what I mean? So I just think some of these things sound really good, but in practice, I'm not sure they're as good as they sound. So I'm in favor of very long limitations, cooling off periods, you know, 5, 10 years kind of things. But I don't think we want to say with some young people in the audience here who want to go serve on the Hill, because people often have to register to lobby to advocate for some of the stuff you're talking about here.
Yep.
Which is ridiculous.
What's that?
It is ridiculous that they have to.
Oh, well, I agree with that. That's a whole other discussion. But I just think I've seen people say if you work 6 months on Capitol Hill, you're banned from ever being a registered lobbyist. I'm like, what about all these fantastic lobbyists, quote, that work for nonprofits that come into my office and try to get me to vote for increased NIH funding to help cure cancer? They're technically lobbyists because they're lobbying on behalf of the American Cancer Association. So I just think some people, you know, some sound bites sound really good. I'm very much in favor of prohibitions on executive branch, agency branch, and Capitol Hill. But I'm in favor of them being pretty long, 5 or 10 years, which I think does cool it off completely, and your contacts are not relevant anymore, so you can't trade on the public trust. But I don't go towards the lifetime ban, because I just think that's not how the world works.
I'm going to switch over from questions from our audience. So the first one is, if elected, would you fix our democracy first?
If you have more questions, I'm going to come around and collect them as well, so feel free to pass them
You
on.
got some?
I would fix our democracy first, but there's a lot of things that need to be fixed. So, you know, I'm proposing to fix our democracy not just by talking about some of the issues we've talked about here. But I'm also talking about things like national service, which I also think will fix our democracy by creating a culture where people who graduate from high school are encouraged to serve their country in all kinds of new, exciting programs to remind the American people that we actually have a lot in common with each other. And common purpose is really important, because when I look at the issues we face as a nation, some of these issues our failure to enact common sense gun safety laws, our failure to deal with climate change, these are entirely due to money in politics. But there are other issues that are more complex. Like, for example, we haven't passed common sense, comprehensive immigration reform in this country. And it's really hurting our nation. That's not because of money in politics. All the, quote, big money in politics was supporting comprehensive immigration reform. That's because we're so divided. And people have been taught to fear the immigrant. And so we also, if we want to cure this democracy or fix this democracy, we not only have to change the laws to get rid of gerrymandering, to get money out of politics, but we have to do real things to remind the American people that we're all in this together. You know, and that getting back to the roots that this nation grew from, you know, into the nation of freedom and liberty that it is, and I think it grew in the sunshine of a cause we're fighting for, this notion of common purpose. I think we've got to get back to that.
So abuse of power is an emerging theme right now. How would you work with Congress on legislation that would prevent presidential abuse of power in the future?
Well, I think there's a lot of things we've got to do. I mean, you know, we have, the Congress of the United States gave an open-ended authorization for military force 18 years ago that's allowed President Bush, Obama, and Trump to wage war all over the world. They just had to prove that it was somehow related to Al-Qaeda. That's ridiculous. That's the Congress effectively delegating its responsibilities to the president. So I would actually look at that. I think that the whole emergency powers of the president needs to be looked at legislatively. I'm a big believer in reasserting Congress's role in our democracy because I think it's been absent. And I think as a result, two branches of government have become too powerful. The executive branch has become too powerful, and the courts have become too powerful. For example, the Supreme Court last year, maybe it was 2 years ago, decided whether the Clean Air Act of 1972 covered greenhouse gases. That is not a job of the Supreme Court of the United States. It's a job of the Congress of the United States to decide how we regulate greenhouse gases. But because Congress is so inactive, these things all get waged in the courts. We basically legislate through the Supreme Court. And so we got to get Congress back on its game. We got to get Congress legislating, and I think that would also push back executive authority. And by the way, the power of the courts. I mean, I've never talked to them about it, but I bet the 9 unelected members of the Supreme Court actually don't want to be hearing most of the cases they hear. They actually think the Congress should deal with it.
So as an independent voter, it's important that primary elections are open to independent voters. In 2016, over 25 million people were banned from voting because they weren't registered with a party. Could you speak about open primaries or nonpartisan primaries?
Well, again, I mean, I think your system here is good. I think independent voters should be able to participate in primaries. You know, the fastest growing political party in this country is unaffiliated voters. And I think their voices should be held urban primaries.
But they should be registered in order to vote.
Well, yeah, we have to be, you know, but I'm in favor of ways to make it easy for people to be registered. I'm in favor of things like auto registration. I think things to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to pre-register, all that kind of stuff I'm in favor of. But I do think being able to choose which primary vote is a good thing.
Okay, so this one's timely since 2 people just went to jail. Controversy to federal law, foreign money is being funneled into the U.S. election. These are breaches of national security that must not become normalized. What will you do?
Well, there's so many things we need to do with foreign interference in our election, including having a president who believes that it happened and it's a sincere decision, and a president who doesn't encourage more of it. But I mean, I don't know if I'm supposed to make political comments. So that's all I'll say there. But this is what I would do. First of all, I would provide more resources to local governments so that they can harden their election infrastructure. The second thing I would do is I would prohibit foreign ownership of critical vendors to election systems. We, in my home state of Maryland, we had this controversy several years ago when we realized that the technology company that controlled the database, the voter database in the state of Maryland, was majority owned by a Russian oligarch with close ties to Putin. Now, if there's a company that's integral to our national security and they want to get sold, the U.S. government has to sign off on who buys them, with the express reasons that we don't want certain foreign owners owning critical national security or defense contractors. I think the same thing should apply to vendors of election systems. That's the other thing I would do. And then the third thing we got to do is we got to pass laws that regulate how technology companies can disseminate false and misleading information. Because that's the most powerful force, right? We're very close to technologies that are known as deepfakes, where technology companies can take my name, my voice and my appearance, and impose it into a completely fake video that not even my mother or wife would know it's not me, doing things and saying things I never did or never said. Think about the effect that's going to have on our democracy when they can take, videos of Nancy Pelosi or Kevin McCarthy and drop them into completely fake scenarios that no one can tell that they're fake, having them say and do things they never said or did. In a world with all the suspicion and all the conspiracy theories that are out there, this will be validation of those theories, because it'll actually get people realistically saying that we're doing them. And I think we need strong regulations of these technology companies.
Well, great, and I'm going to follow up on that with the current state of the Federal Elections Commission. What do we do to have regulations?
We got to have an FEC that works. Right now it's stalemate, it's got to be reformed. I think you probably should have one director.
One director. So the next question is, you've already sort of spoken to this, but do you support an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would allow states to regulate campaign spending and disclosure?
Sure.
Okay.
Why not? We need so much more of it. Why we should have it everywhere.
So freedom of speech is an asset and a liability. How can we, as people, ensure freedom of speech maintains our right to have an open discourse while limiting the abuse of this right? Or the way to spin information, or to create alternative realities, as this person commented.
Yeah. Well, obviously, freedom of speech is incredibly central to who we are as a nation, and there are very, 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 very few limitations that are permissible, in my judgment, on the free expression. But things like I just talked about with deep fakes, the way I would solve that problem is you can create a deep fake if you want, fine. Because in a way that's free speech. But if you use it for political purposes, you have to disclose that it was altered, and you have to disclose who paid for it. So that if you see a video of Kevin McCarthy or Nancy Pelosi doing something or saying something they didn't do, if it doesn't say this video has been altered and it was paid for by X at the bottom, then we have a law that says the technology companies and social media companies have to take it down. That to me is an appropriate balance. It allows people to do this stuff, but it puts strict requirements on how, it's very similar to, if I put an ad on television about my campaign, I have to say paid for by John Delaney at the end of it. So you know that it's me who's promoting this. Similarly, if some ad from one of my competitors goes up on air and it attacks me, they have to say they paid for it. Those same ads on social media, you don't have to have any of those disclosures. It's ridiculous.
Okay, so the next question I'm going to add a little money politics spin to. We've seen pharmaceutical companies and others lobby on Capitol Hill, and can you elaborate on your positions ensuring that we have health care for everyone, but ensuring that the pharmaceutical companies and those that are trying to manipulate the health care for all process don't
Well, I'm for universal health care, and I have a plan called Medicare that gives every single American basic health care as a right, citizenship for free. Now, it allows them to have choices. So it's not like the single payer system that effectively makes all private insurance illegal. My plan is very much like Germany's, a mixed model, where everyone gets basic federal health care as a right of citizenship, and then they have the ability to choose things. Very much like the way Medicare works, by the way, because that's what Medicare really is, if you think about it. People get Medicare as a basic right once they're 65, but then they have options, supplementals, things like that they can buy. So that's the way my plan works. Look, we got to rein in lobbyists, and we've got to rein in money in politics. It's destroying our democracy. Again, though, under freedom of speech, we're always going to have some of this. You're always going to have some of this. So that's why you got to pass common sense laws that work.
Great. Well, I'm going to add a money politics spin to this one because we know the military-industrial complex has a lockhold step in D.C. What will you do to keep shipyards safe? And what will you do to protect our military? I know some of the weapon systems that are passing in our budget are actually not what the military wants, but it's what the lobbyists want.
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing. When I was in, I'll tell you a story. When I was in Congress, there's a plane called the Warthog. People know what this plane
They
is.
still use it today.
It's a very iconic plane because it's got a huge Gatling gun on the front of it. It fires these very loud rounds of very large bullets. It's like traditional ammunition. And it flies low, and it shoots these bullets with this huge Gatling gun. The Gatling gun's like the whole size of the plane. They say the plane actually goes a little bit in reverse when the Gatling gun is going. And it makes a huge noise. And they say the noise has been one of the scariest factors in this thing. It used to be made in my district. It hasn't been made in my district in 50 years. Pieces of it are made all over the country, a lot of it in Arizona. The military has basically been saying they have wanted this plane for decades. They don't see any utility of this plane in the modern Air Force. But it always keeps getting funded. Because, it's got pieces of it are made everywhere. And in those constituent, let's face it, those districts, it's jobs. This plane has a bit of a cult following too, by the way. There was no issue in my congressional office that I received more letters on than this plane. And that's why things get funded that aren't necessarily, but let's face it, Congress has the power of the purse. It doesn't, the military doesn't determine military spending, the Congress determines military spending. We should always be looking at these discrepancies and making sure members of Congress justify why you know better than the military on some of these questions.
Excuse me. That was my question, and I thank you for kind of answering it. My thing is, I have worked for the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. I've known other shipyards in my 34 years. Now, in my 34 years, we used to have a handful of shipyards. And we used to have Pease Air Force Base, Groton, I don't know how many other bases, and all due to the government's, I call it lack of leadership and judgment. We have lost all but the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, San Diego, Hawaii as bases. Now, we lost almost every military base in this country that had things worked on as far as submarines, airplanes. You try and find a submarine base these days, there's not that many. There's Hawaii, there's Pearl, there's the Navy Yard, and San Diego. Those are the only three we have. Now, I'm ex-Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. We went through 3 bracks. I was lucky to survive it, but a lot of my friends weren't. They got laid off. No. Are you going to do anything to prevent this again?
So, I voted for all the defense budgets when I was in Congress. So I support our military. These processes about determining where money gets spent is always said, it becomes this political issue.
Well, this is common sense, it's not political. If, and I say if, the Navy Yard in this area, I don't know whether you know it or not, but our Navy Yard, had it closed down, this would have affected jobs as far as Massachusetts, not just Rochester and surrounding areas, but as far as Mass and in Maine, and more places.
I agree, listen, and the jobs are good jobs, and I support them. And that's the thing with these issues, you know, we talk a lot about how much we spend on healthcare, which is a lot. But it's also like become the number one employer in our country. A lot of people have views on military spending. Some say it's too much, but it's also one of the largest employers in our country. So these issues always intersect.
I say it's not enough.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next card, and feel free to keep submitting these cards.
May I
Oh,
ask a question without a card?
sure.
Congressman Delaney, in your introduction, you talked about the hollowing out of large parts of America. And you said that that did not have to happen, and that we could stop it. How could we have stopped it?
Well, there's several things I think we could have done. So last year in our country, 80% of the professionally managed venture capital, which is the money that goes to the hot startup businesses, that was invested in 50 counties in this country, out of 3,100 counties. So 1.6% of our counties got 80% of the money. There are things we could have done to change that. Tax policy can do that, for example, by creating tax incentives for people to invest in communities that are struggling economically. The other thing we could do, we're talking about government contracting. You know, the U.S. government is the largest buyer of goods and services in the world. And as you know, in Bethesda, Maryland, which is where you live, we have a lot of government contractors in our market. And we have them in San Francisco, and we have them in Boston. We have them in places that are thriving and have large, diverse economies. I would favor and have proposed a preference for our government contractors, that 25% of government contracts should go to government contractors that have half their employees in distressed communities. So right now we have a preference in the government contracting process for minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, and veteran-owned businesses, and I support those preferences fully. I would add an additional preference, where if you're running a government contract, you actually have jobs in places that need it, you get a preference, because I think that's the interest of the taxpayers. You know, we used to spend about 5% of our economy on infrastructure. Now we spend about 2.5%. China spends 8%. We need to increase our investment in infrastructure, but it needs a particular focus in communities that are struggling. Because again, the Washington, D.C. metro area can actually afford to fund more of its infrastructure than a lot of the hollowed out towns that I've seen around this country. And something like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which I think is the best workers' tax program we have in this country, I would double it in communities that are left behind. So effectively, I would map out the country based on statistical economic data, which we do, by the way. And you characterize communities as economically growing or economically struggling. The communities that are economically struggling, I would create tax incentives for private investors to invest in those communities. I would have, as part of the National Infrastructure Program, have a disproportionate amount of the money going to those communities. I would double the Earned Income Tax Credit in those communities, because that would make it easier for people to hire workers there. And then I would require 25% of the government contractors to have half their employees there. Those four things working together won't turn around every single community, but it'll turn around a lot of them. That's what I would do.
So I'm going to ask you a follow-up. Do you think that government contractors should be able to lobby or use their government contracts to make campaign contributions?
So again, I'm in favor of lots of limitations on lobbying activities. Once those are in place, I would apply them equitably to all enterprises. Because there are some companies you don't think of as government contract and actually have a government contract. You know what I mean? You think of them as something else, but they actually have a division that provides government contracting. So I think it's kind of hard to say. I wouldn't allow government effect, like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are effectively government agencies, and they used to be able to lobby. I wouldn't let that happen. But I think we need to do things to put limits on lobbying activities, have more transparency, more disclosure, limitations on donations, close the revolving door loophole. We need to do all those things. Once those things are done, I would apply them fairly.
Okay, so here's one on political parties. Do you think that they have too much power in our democracy? For example, South Carolina and other states, the Republican Party has canceled their primary despite having 4 candidates announced. And also parties have a lot of say in how the debates are controlled. So
I'm aware of that.
thoughts on political parties' influence?
Well, I think it's too great. I mean, listen, I think most people, I mean, I'm a proud Democrat, but I think most people view the two-party system as deeply flawed. The question is there a better system?
No.
You know, it's kind of like people ask me about capitalism all the time. Well, and I was a capitalist, right? I started 2 companies. I was the youngest CEO in the history of the New York Stock Exchange. Capitalism is...
It's better than socialism.
Well, that's my point. Capitalism has deep flaws. The amount of income inequality that it creates is extraordinary. And it's got deep, deep flaws with it. The issue is there's no better system.
Exactly.
And we should have public policy to make capitalism as just as possible and to take the benefits of capitalism and make sure they're spread broadly. But there's no better system. So you can pick holes at it all you want and they're legitimate, but there's not a better alternative. And I think that's to some extent the situation we have with the political parties. But I think we should always be doing things to try to limit the power of the political parties. Because they naturally will seek power. And they'll seek monopoly power by nature. That's the nature of the political process and the beast. So therefore, almost every effort to rein it in is needed and will only keep you at a kind of a draw. That's how I think about it.
So we see the growth of dark money in our political process. What would you do to rein in the influence of these C4 groups, to disclose any of that dark money?
Yep.
A checkoff box on the taxes to ensure that there's no foreign influence? Other thoughts?
All that stuff.
Dark money.
Yeah, dark money's, you know, the transparency thing is a huge issue. You know, it's a huge, huge issue how much money flows through the political system with no accountability and no transparency. And I think every issue has to be approached with, we should be seeking full transparency. Because if someone is trying to influence an election, the American people deserve to know who they are and how much they're spending. Because if you get that, then you at least empower the American people to exercise all of the rights they have in the democracy. But absent that information, it can easily be manipulated.
How is the best way to get Congress to function better and to work together to be less partisan and less divided? And what would be the best combo of reforms to make sure that that happens?
Well, gerrymandering. I mean, I was voted the 3rd most bipartisan member of Congress, and I was quite proud of that. I don't think it's a dirty word. But I remember when I would work on some very big bipartisan bills, I would go to members in either the Democrat or Republican Party, and I'd say, I've got this idea for, quote, infrastructure, fill in the blank. And this is why it's a good idea. And they'd say, oh, I like that idea. And then they'd look at it. If they were Republican, they'd say, you got a lot of Democrats on that bill. And I'd say, well, yeah, it's a bipartisan bill. That's the point. Or I'd go to a Democrat and I'd say the same thing, and they'd be like, you have so-and-so on that bill, that Republican. He or she is crazy. I'd say, yeah, I kind of agree with you. Some of the things they say I don't agree with, but as a member of Congress, they're allowed to co-sponsor legislation, and my bill's bipartisan, and they're on it. And those people would say to me, you know, I'd like to be on your bill, but, you know, politically, my only real risk is my primary, and they're going to attack me for being in bed with the other side. So why don't you come back to me with that idea after my primary?
Oh, come on.
Oh, yeah,
That's ridiculous.
I agree.
Why can't we use...
And gerrymandering creates that dynamic, because it creates these one, you know, the most productive members of Congress are ones that can get beat in a general election. Because those people sit there in their seat and they're like, I'm going to get reelected. The best way for me to get reelected is not only to get all my Democrats or my Republicans to vote for me, but to get some of the folks on the other side. That creates a winning coalition for me in a competitive district. So how do I market to people on the other side? Well, I tell them how much I work with members of their party. So if I was a Democrat running in a competitive district, and I'm in a general election and it's tough, one of the things I'm going to promote is my bipartisan work. And you can't promote your bipartisan work unless you actually do it. So, you know, if you could wave a magic wand, you'd make every single congressional district in this country 50-50. Then you'd see a Congress that works.
Okay. Would you make Election Day a holiday?
Yes, it's in my bill, Open Our Democracy Act.
It used to be.
So we talked a lot about reform at the federal level. What do you think states should do to pass all of this reform at the state level?
Well, what I would like to see states do, where they have a lot of control, is do things to make it easier for people to vote. And I think that's where I think a lot of work can be done at the state level. Right, as I said, pre-registration for young people I think is great. I think automatic registration I think is great. I actually think voting by mail is great. I think anything that makes it easier to vote I think is really good for the democracy. And I think states can make a lot of that stuff happen. Early voting, great. All that stuff is great. And that's at the, all that action is at the state level.
What is pre-registration for young people?
Pre-registration means you're 16. Maryland, I think you can do it at 16 and a half. And you can basically go and say, you know, I'm going to turn 18 one day. And I'm going to register now, kind of put it on file. And then it becomes active when they're 18. So it effectively gives them a lead time. Because, you know, what often happens is someone turns 18 and they're like, I turned 18 in October, you know, the November election's coming up, and they don't register. And maybe the state doesn't have on-site registration, which is another positive thing. Whereas with the pre-registration, you can have people go around to high schools and say, you know, you all are eligible, you know, you can do it online, or get this form and send it in the mail, and you can pre-register. So you don't have to worry about it. When you turn 18, it's just going to happen. Simple thing, actually.
Is it happening now in some states?
Maryland has it.
Does Maryland?
Yeah, I bet 15 states have it. But it's the simplest thing. It's not allowing anyone to be registered to vote before they're 18. It's not allowed. It just basically, effectively gives you a longer time to do it. Because seriously, if you turn 18 in September, and you're really interested in voting, you turn 18, your state doesn't allow registration at the election, you got to get your act together to make sure you do it. Just gives you more time. It's like early voting.
So I wanted to thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
being
This
with
was
us
great.
today.
I enjoyed it.
And I think
Thanks for the good questions.
you might be sticking around if someone wants to
Yeah,
take a picture
sure.
or have a conversation.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. Are you related to the young person?
You're the only person talking, so. There we go.